By all accounts, I shouldn't be making this video. I don't have a well-developed thesis or something specific to say, and for whatever reason this seemed like the best way I could get it to all make sense. This week, following some in-real-life events, most prominently a very successful in-real-life conference, I thought that my political consciousness would take a certain turn. From this point in 2022, the macrocosmically political things would matter less. The task before us was building. The task before was defining what we believed in coming up with more general positions towards modernity itself, and trying to stake out a separate piece from whatever remained of our political order. Of course, I understood that large-scale politics at the national or international level would certainly play a role in this process. Things like, very prominently, the truckers' protest had to be part of the equation. How we related to our government, how we related to the corporations and the banks that ruled our lives, and what could be done to come to something more authentic and more life-giving for the future of humanity. Events like the recently totalitarian and censorious actions by the Trudeau government in Canada certainly played a role in all of this. But events of the general news cycle, more distant and detached events that occurred in foreign countries, would be of secondary concern. History has a way of dealing us strange hands, and no sooner had I set to this resolution in my own mind than did I immediately violate it. This, of course, began with a very prominent event now dominating the news, the Russia-Ukraine war of 2022. A storm whose clouds we could see gathering on the horizon, but whose final arrival immediately seized all of the headlines and all of the attention away from anything else. Initially, of course, I was skeptical of this event having any kind of significance. The war was certainly a tragedy, but not something that directly concerned me. As cynical as it might seem from a European point of view, from my position as a denizen of North America, and with a family whose nationalities cross the border, I was much more concerned with the growing totalitarian control increasingly exhibited by government and non-governmental organizations, both inside Canada and the United States. Frankly, diverting the news to a border conflict in far Eastern Europe seemed like a giant smokescreen for the abuses of prominent figures in the Western world. But something about this attitude changed gradually over the course of this week, not so much due to my growing awareness of the news, but my growing awareness of Americans' and Europeans' reaction to that news. Here, I suppose, I have to include a confession. In addition to the little tidbits I could catch reading news sites and following my favorite content creators on Telegram, the floodgates only opened once I broke my own principle and began reading Twitter. I suppose it started innocently enough, perusing the feed of my good friend Aaron McIntyre, more or less to see what new content he had produced over the week I had been away. But, as social media is wont to do, one click went to another, one hashtag to one @response to one retweet, and pretty soon a full picture of the entire internet's takes on the ongoing Russia-Ukraine war were visible in all of their disgusting and putrid glory. And I found myself recoiling in utter horror, having a reaction that I'm still trying to process. Of course, war is horrifying. It is naturally degrading to the human form and to the human soul. But rereading the thoughts and collective opinions of people who should know better conjured in my own mind the utter monstrosity of where we are as a people in this late modernity. Right off the bat, this video being a video about emotional reactions, I can't get around my own feelings towards the Russia-Ukraine war. For the record, I've advised everyone involved in distant politics to stay far away from picking sides, from choosing the lesser of two evils. This is never a good option. But I suppose that doesn't stop us from having emotional reactions, even though they aren't really positions I would care to go to the wall for. And even on this front, if I'm being honest, I'm still entirely divided. My own ethnic background probably has some role to play in this. Having one side of the family being from pseudo-Eastern European extraction does give you some biases. Quite frankly, I'm normally very hostile to any sort of Russian aggression coming out of the East. The crimes of Russia against the ethnic populations of Europe in the 20th century certainly, in my mind, make it no friends to nationalism or tradition in any sense of the word. Of course, I don't really have any deep cultural affinity with Ukraine. To be honest, the nations I have a deep simpatico with are further west, in the Catholic countries like Hungary or Poland. Still, it's hard not to feel something of a common cause. The Ukrainians suffered just like the rest of Eastern Europe did, and the reasons for their oppression were deeply linked to their ethnic identity as Ukrainians, even if the motivations of their oppressors were not deeply linked to their own Russian ethnicity. Honestly, it's hard not to root for people who are defending their own homelands, who are defending their own nations. But is that really what's going on? Quite frankly, it's hard to say, because as much as my emotions go out to the Ukrainians, I know deep down that the situation is more complicated. Russia was ravaged by the international community, raided and left as a cultural husk in the 1990s, and then preyed upon in the early 2000s by NGOs who wanted to see it as an extension and a cultural duplicate of Western Europe. Could I not sympathize with a nation, even a larger nation, who wanted to get out from the thumb of the international community and the stifling control of the global American empire with everything that entailed? And this was only augmented by the fact that I knew, intellectually at least, that the temporal government of Ukraine, far from being nationalist in its motivation, was deeply connected with apparatchiks inside the State Department. Whether or not any of its temporal leaders were or were not acting in the best interest of their nation as the Ukrainian nation, it was clear to me, at any rate, that Ukrainian interests were being used as a front for more nefarious ends. Any international result which could be used to humiliate Russia, and by extension Vladimir Putin, would be used as a reason to expand the influence of the global American empire and to possibly even accomplish regime change, and eventually cultural change inside Russia itself. As they used to say, it's a simple game of consolidate and surrender. Global homogenization takes another step forward, and the human soul retreats again. And this being what it is, we have only a conundrum in front of us, a cipher. Two malevolent titans clashing on the international stage, the real humans beneath them, fighting for their national honor, fighting for their homes, going to battle, potentially perishing, either in valor or obscurity, depending on what the cruel fates decreed. And this would be a human tragedy, but not a new one, and while certainly worthy of reaction and mourning, it's not the thing I'm reacting to today. Instead, what caught my ire was simply how the West, and in particular the chattering professional classes, have chosen to react to the last few days of the Russia-Ukraine war. I guess this was to be expected, but whatever prudence and sobriety the media class had towards war in the 2000s during Iraq and Afghanistan has well and truly evaporated, with most of the media establishment, professional bloggers, and leftists jumping full hog on one side of the war, cheerleading a war effort they have very little understanding of, pontificating and playing pundit to a set of conflicts and cultural mores which they lack even a basic background to approach properly. And I know, chattering class is going to chatter. This is what they always do, or what they have always done since the advent of social media. And perhaps this is me just being away from Twitter for a little too long, but was it always this bad? Since when did blue checkmark journalists, writers, and sometimes even leaders of intelligence agencies openly proclaim on Twitter that all-out war against a nuclear power might be preferable in the name of LGBTQ rights? Since when did respectable journalists start comparing geopolitical enemies to characters from Star Wars and Harry Potter? Since when did the same people who routinely complained about toxic masculinity rejoice in masculine guerrilla sniper teams taking out Russian officers? And when did the people in favor of absolute gun control the ones who thought it was child abuse to have a gun in the house behind 3 locks, then turn around this week and proclaim that young boys, children in fact, should take up AK-47s and Molotov cocktails and charge directly at an incoming tank line rolling into Kiev. And of course, not to be outdone by the progressive normie blue check marks, my favorite creators on BreadTube were keeping abreast of the situation, most prominently among them Vosh, who seemed in all his communications to tirelessly cover every detail of propaganda that came out of the State Department, aggrandizing and cheerleading military forces he had no understanding of, superimposing progressive pet issues on the Ukrainian military apparatus, and then, strangely enough, re-memeing the stories ironically when they turned out to be false. I suppose that famous expression by Karl Marx, first as tragedy, then as farce, is the only real element of Marxist philosophy modern progressives are willing to live out in their own lives. But nevertheless, this was par for the course. The whole roiling pit of Twitter seemed to be a tournament of hyperbolic reactions, mindless, narcissistic warmongering, and adolescent hysteria. I guess this is just the way of the world these days, and I was well on my way to dismiss the entire affair with the words "sic transit glorious mundi," when I caught one truly insightful tweet, emerging from the bottom of it all, like the spirit of hope buried in Pandora's box. And this was a tweet by Default Friend saying the following: "It's not hard to imagine Ukraine's official Twitter content strategist saying to a community manager, 'Last quarter, being sassy about Russia got the most engagement, let's do that again.'" And with these words, the whole chaotic mess started falling into place. Because what was really disgusting about the hysteria, the hyperbole, and the narcissism on display everywhere on Twitter wasn't simply its infantile nature, but rather the fact that it was materially hurting things. It wasn't so much reacting to the war, it also was in a sense fueling it, making sure that whatever happened politically happened in the most ostentatious and politically damaging way, making sure no one could save face in a compromise, ensuring that both sides felt absolutely antagonized, absolutely disrespected, and as always, sassy. I find the question falls into stark relief if we just describe the military situation, the conflict as it stands, without the chattering classes, without any politics involved. What if just the militaries and the military leadership decided this conflict without any necessary appeal to politics, PR, or elections? What if the Russia-Ukraine crisis only had 3 monarchical belligerents, the Kingdom of Russia, ruled by the military apparatus of Russia, the Kingdom of Ukraine, ruled by the military of Ukraine, and the Kingdom of the Global American Empire, ruled by its own military as well? What would the actual issues be at stake? From this point of view, without the messy incorporation of politics, PR, or optics, everything is very simple and straightforward. The conflict is fundamentally a territorial one, and one about the existence of military alliances. In plain terms, Russia wants territory from Ukraine that is ethnically Russian and that it feels was unfairly annexed from it, and also wants to stave off encircling military alliances, which could lead to offensive military action against the motherland, potentially in the future. Conversely, Ukraine wants to stave off any Russian military aggression, to ward off a more powerful enemy that's taken advantage of it in the past, and to discourage any future encroachment on its territory. The role of the global American empire is simply to relatively contain the threat of Russian military expansion, something that, again, without the politics, isn't that complicated. And in this light, the question of territorial gains or redrawn boundaries is very straightforward. Russia has the real military, Ukraine does not. Russia doesn't want to use force, Ukraine doesn't want to have force used against it, and the global American empire doesn't want a military fiasco on its hand that might cost it treasure and blood. The obvious solution is some small symbolic concession, followed by a treaty that would recognize permanent borders under the condition of no further alliances being called on either side, including any additional military alliances made by the global American empire to the smaller party, Ukraine. Broadly, such concessions would resemble conditions that both sides of the current war have in the past described as favorable, and without broader political ambitions, it's hard to see how this would not be a compromise that would ensure peace on all sides. But of course, we don't live in a world without politics. Nobody can make sane compromises anymore without losing face. Each of the three parties involved, be they Russia, Ukraine, or the global American empire, has a bunch of muling classes of politicians, bureaucrats, and professional opinion havers who manifestly are able to accrue power and clout by being on one side and posturing on this issue, even when they have nothing to lose, even when it's other people's lives and other people's children who are going to die in the conflict. In the mode of our current framework, the entire decision over how to manage war and peace in Eastern Europe proceeds like a kind of insane automata, making random decisions, lashing out unpredictably, with total disconnection over what's at stake and what's going on. The majority of what the Russia-Ukraine war is in the global consciousness has nothing to do with the actual territory in question. It has nothing to do with who will actually rule eastern Ukraine. It has everything to do with optics and posturing, with what people can get out of one side winning and the other being humiliated. As such, the decisions being made concerning this war are radically disconnected from any people who have skin in the game, namely the militaries that are contesting over this physical geographic area and the people who live there. And as can be plainly seen in the events this week, such an approach to the problem of war is evolving quickly to the worst possible end for all parties involved. And as is usual, we see the culprit here. It is nothing less than politics, or to put it differently, the infiltration of democratic considerations into a decision-making process that really shouldn't involve them. A war driven by non-stakeholders, non-combatants, and non-denizens, all for the purpose of making a point, running a campaign, or spreading an ideology. Really, it makes absolutely no sense. I know that I'm not saying anything new here. Such observations about the nature of democratic war have long been stated in reactionary circles. Going from pre-modern times to today, it's interesting to see how the entire process evolved, starting first with wars fought mainly by the belligerents themselves over their own homelands and their own property. We then transition to a period of time where war is fought by warrior castes, or eventually professional soldiery. Still, at least before the democratic age, this type of warfare at a large scale had a particular nature to it, at least in Europe. The questions of war and peace, of what was being fought for and where, were central. The power relationships at issue, who could control a space, and who was going to fight and die, could not be confused. And as such, for a time in Christendom, war could be, in fact, limited. The demarcation between soldier and civilian could be firmly established, and all those not directly participating in the war could safely stay uninvolved, free to go about in their other capacities to help humanity and to glorify God as best they could. Yet somewhere in the early 20th century, as the democratic age dawned, all of this sensibility was lost. Wars became essentially political matters, and it was the responsibility of citizens, not simply citizens living in contested areas, to join the war effort, to voice their assent, to propagandize, and to push forward the army and its eventual aims as the war continued. This is where you get the era of mass conscription, the horrific total wars of the mid-20th century, which in some countries never ceased. And of course, along with this, wars as political tools. Think of the White Feather Girls from World War I, and the importance of describing every conflict as a war for democracy in every war since. Under such conditions, war itself can't be limited, because war as politics is by definition totalizing and totalitarian. It has to drag all civilians into it, no matter how remote, to vote either yes or no on its ultimate outcomes. As such, the war itself has a self-escalating mechanism at its core, not simply in the scope of conflict itself, but also in the minds of the people who perceive it. And this, I think, is where we find ourselves today. Of course, this broad outline of war and democracy is nothing new. It's the standard reactionary opinion on the matter, but I think today we're seeing a culmination of this effect with the introduction of social media, the ultimate democratizing force of the early 21st century. Really, the idea of politicized conflict was disgusting already, but I don't think I personally took full stock of the matter until I saw it today with my own eyes. Today, every citizen is not so much a soldier, but a state propagandist, baying for blood, pronouncing on political issues, and playing God with other people's children who they'd gladly send off to war for their own clout and political ends. Really, it would be funny if it wasn't so sad, but it seems that every progressive and every socialist on Twitter today has become just the type of mindless, jingoistic warmonger they always lampooned and put down in their own media. Of course, this time the cause is just, but isn't it always? And despite the fact that you'll see all of these people talking endlessly about the need for a pushback against Russian aggression, none of them will actually take up arms. Certainly, hell will freeze over before any breadtubers like Vosh decide to put down their keyboards and join the Ukrainian resistance, just like the leftists of the 1930s joined the Spanish Republicans. Does this mean progressives have gotten much less authentic? Perhaps, but they've also gotten much more democratic. It's much more an extension of the decisions we've already made as a society, to use territorial conflict as a campaign issue, as something that can generate drama, clout, and political power. Really, it couldn't be more disgusting, and I'm reminded of an image conjured by Curtis Yarvin in the old days of unqualified reservations. The image of Goya's Witch's Sabbath, this time with a great he-goat replaced by a giant pig representing democracy itself. So much suffering, so much confusion, so much raw waste and chaos created, and yet the only thing anyone can think about anymore is their own clout, is their own ability to be seen as one of the good people, on the right side of history, doing the right thing, speaking up in this moment of history. I have been told by some ancient thinkers that war can ennoble a people, that there is an opportunity for valor and heroism, but modern man has entirely twisted the affair, in which our total disconnection has replaced courage with narcissism and sacrifice with self-aggrandizement. And I know, perhaps I am being a little bit hyperbolic myself here, reacting emotionally to something that really should be approached and put in proper perspective. But what can we really make of the situation we've found ourselves in today? I remember hearing that famous expression as a child, war is hell, and it always conjured very particular imagery. I think back to Saving Private Ryan, hell being the fear, the utter carnage, seeing one's fellow man completely ground down by a mechanical war machine, and wondering when that same war machine might choose you as the victim. But on a deeper examination, there also is that other component of hell war embodies, the corrupting component that many authors and filmmakers have chosen to highlight, most prominently in my own mind, Stanley Kubrick in his film Full Metal Jacket. There is that way that war strips us of our humanity and our souls, as the grimness of the circumstances themselves dehumanize us, allow us to do cruel things beyond anything we could have thought possible. Here, war certainly does have a corrupting and demonic element as well. But in our own modern and technological society, it does seem like we've crossed a threshold. Because now, not simply the soldiers, but the media, and not just the media, but the citizenry themselves have a chance to participate and learn this demonic cruelty without ever facing battle themselves. As the nature of political warfare goes, this is where the incentive always lies: to jump on the bandwagon, to engage in performative cruelty and sadism, and to always back the winning side. And so the machine we created rolls ever onward, killing soldiers, killing civilians, and broadcasting the results live every day for purposes of ideology and clout and politics, so that every one of us watching at home can slowly be transformed from man into pig, from pig into demon, our diabolic natures augmented with the delivery of every new piece of performative narcissistic cruelty, shipped in daily, 288 characters at a time.